Welcome to Discerning the Forms, our podcast. I'm Nick.
I'm Anthony. I like that smoke, like the whoosh,
Yeah,
like the animation. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I'm getting
I don't know if I've
fancy.
seen that before.
Yeah. So shout out to any Odyssey viewers. I don't know. There might have been one or two. Maybe as the podcast develops and you notice that we're here and we continue to be here, will grow. And so if there are any Odyssey viewers, hey, give us some crypto. We'll take it.
I like crypto.
Yeah.
It's unregulated.
Yes. Yeah, which I think that will just jump into our topic for tonight for this episode. Speaking of crypto. Yeah. We are excited because we're going to be talking about politics, and I promise that this is going to be different than politic episodes that you've heard. I hope, I know, right?
Well, it all depends on where our conversation leads, but I imagine, at least from my own perspective, I'm not coming at this as a Republican or a Democrat.
Yeah.
Or even like a libertarian or Green Party. Like I don't really affiliate with any of that.
You've
stuff
dropped
anymore,
all the
at least
isms.
in terms of
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I still have, and we'll get into that.
Okay, we got one ism.
Commitments and
yeah.
Yeah. I got like
we're trying to be Christocentric.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, it's like I think we're all monarchists if we're Christian. If we're being completely honest about what it is, like. Obviously a monarchy that comes with a lot of baggage and stuff, but like in terms of like the way we see the cosmic hierarchy and government, Jesus
at least
is
spiritually.
King, so
there's different
sure.
different perspectives in Christianity and politics, but at least spiritual, I think, angels and the heavenly host and so forth. So let's go ahead and dive in. Anthony, politics.
Yes. I think part of what we wanted to do was just talk about our journeys and to where we've gotten to. Because I think that can help set up some of the how we're going to dialogue about politics. Because I think to say politics is very loaded. Just the word monarchy is loaded, so is politics. So, how we think about the nature of the state, the nature of, especially if you're American, you have rights and you have the Constitution that defends and like kind of establishes the rights and the way that the government can't infringe on certain things, and even though they do and they have for decades upon decades. Not to get too far into any sort of critiques, but I guess that's kind of what I was, we were thinking is
kind of your journey. Your journey. What makes you the kind of political? What kind of political animal are you, and what happened? How'd you get there? And so. Then we can
long, arduous journey.
Yeah, and because there's so much, and there might be a lot we get into.
Yeah.
We definitely want to have some more episodes on this, so that I don't know, because there's a lot that gets into it. So, Anthony, I'll just kind of have you go first. What is your story, your journey? And we kind of got into that in the first episode, but maybe you can kind of expound a little deeper and maybe even define some things and bring some of that journey to bear tonight.
Yeah, I'm happy to come clean or
is this like confession
that I'm in? Because well, being in a church, when you're in a church community for a long time, and you want to, when you know that you're sort of at odds with a lot of the main sort of thread of the community, like politically, you don't often talk about those things a lot because you're trying to. One, I recognize how divisive political conversation tends to become these days because we're so moralized in everything that we do. Like everybody's just moralizing all the time, and it makes it very difficult to have any sort of um fun in those conversations for people. I often will always have fun because I'm happy to be not not a normal run of the mill, person. I'm sort of a contrarian in my heart, and that comes to that. You'll see that bearing out in my journey. But so initially, I grew up in a pretty conservative household, and by conservative, I mean um, politically always voting to the right. I think my dad voted for like Ross Perot once, but I think he said he regretted it because he didn't think it really made a difference. But I'm like, well, I thought that's kind of cool that he stuck to his principles and didn't vote for, what was Perot in the was that with Bob Dole was the Republican candidate? Was that election, or was that before? I don't remember. It doesn't really matter. It
Clinton.
doesn't matter.
Somebody can drop it in the comments.
Yeah, I don't know which one he was. It was either the first Clinton or because Clinton had 2 terms, so there was right. It was either the first one or the second one, but
I'm sure it
but
was
I
the
grew up in a
first
very.
one.
I think it was the first one because I don't think he. Well, it doesn't matter. So either way, I grew up in a very conservative household in terms of politically conservative, and um, it just means you vote right. You listen to Rush Limbaugh. Mark Belling's a guy in Milwaukee here that's still on the air that I will randomly just as I'm flipping through channels, I'll hear him.
And do you go to
And
Carmen
yeah,
concerts and buy Carmen records too? Is that what comes?
no,
I did. I did.
I
I
did
had a
go.
Carmen.
Yeah,
I went and saw Satan Bites the or that. What do you have that song? Satan Bites the Dust or something.
no, that was not part of my childhood imagination. So,
Oh darn.
no, I
now.
saw. Well, so sorry. Continue your thought on Carmen.
Carmen. I can't believe I brought it up. Um. Yeah, Carmen. There's no more thoughts. It's just Carmen. He's
Okay,
passed
it's
away
just Carmen.
recently.
Yeah.
Feel bad, but that's
Oh,
why
you're thinking of him. He's on your mind.
he's on my mind.
Yeah. Okay. um so no, I grew up in a politically conservative household, and that put me, actually, it's funny enough, it put me at odds with a lot of my friends growing up because a lot of their parents are very, very left of center, very liberal politically. Um so that always I always felt like stress about that because I always feel like I had to argue well, um and then in 2004 I went to see George W. Bush at a rally in Milwaukee with my parents, which was the Bush Kerry, because I was too young to vote in the first one, the first Bush election, the Bush Gore one, and so after in that same year after the summer, I became a Christian later that year. Um, and that began to that was kind of starting the shifting for me in terms of how I thought about politics. And so that year I graduated high school, I moved out of my parents' house, and then I was living on my own. I was in a band, I was doing a lot of stuff, and I started, I think it was a few years down the road, because I didn't really think about politics as much at that time because I was just being a musician, and I always had opinions and stuff, but I wasn't really like deep into stuff. I sort of got into the conspiratorial world after a little while. Just stuff like,
Is that like Alex
I don't want to, I'm
Jones?
not going to name names. Yeah, Alex
I
Jones,
already
and
did it.
which
Yeah.
yeah, which at the time he was and this is
He
something we
was
can get into
interesting back
maybe another
he
time or
was cool
later.
back then.
Well, yeah, I thought he was way more he was less broken, I would say. I think right
Oh
now
yeah.
he's just disheveled and broken, and but at the time he was commenting and being critical of things that I thought now have come to bear really true to a lot of what he said and a lot of things that he had predicted, which is interesting to think about. So I was getting to that stuff, and then I got into the world of because I was as a Christian, I was like, I can't like support war. Like I just don't feel it in my heart. Like I can be, yeah, let's go to war, especially the way that the aesthetics of the U.S. military, and this is not against anybody in the military, but it just seemed to me like I couldn't really do that. So I struggled in the 2008 election because I really disliked John McCain for my whole life because I just thought he was kind of a snake. And Obama I didn't really like either because I just am not a liberal politically like that. At least at the time, especially at the time, I wasn't still either. I never was. Um, Never that whole framework never was attractive to me. Um, and so then I heard Ron. I don't know how I have to think about this more about how I actually stumbled onto Ron Paul. But he was the jet fuel that ignited me to be like, oh, I can be a Christian and I can be against war, but I don't have to be like some weird liberal who like wants the government to, yada yada yada, welfare, this and that. And so that began a whole journey into Austrian economics, Ron Paul libertarianism, and just the moral framework of libertarianism itself, which I became kind of an anarcho-capitalist, which just means you believe in that the state is not valid because it functions on violence. So taxation itself is violence, and it is theft, which I think I hold that today still a little bit, just because of the way American sort of the American system is functioned and how the state works. I do think it is still the morally correct position. But I'm no longer. So I was an anarcho-capitalist. I thought it was the only way you could actually be a libertarian was an anarcho-capitalist, because I think anything else, at least at the time, I thought just compromised everything. Anytime you had any sense of a public ownership or state, I was like, no, that's not how this works. That you
Yeah.
can't
Wasn't
say
purist.
that taxation is theft. It wasn't
Yeah.
purist enough. So this gets into I start to unravel some of the purity ideological stuff later in the journey. So libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism. Um, I was more as a libertarian. I felt like I was more philosophically concerned than I was in any sense pragmatically concerned about ever winning elections or like ever anything winning. It was more like I just want to be principled and know what like philosophically where I'm at, and that if that can like mash up with my Christian commitments, which to me are always the highest commitments of anything I have, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. It's Christianity is like the what I need to be most concerned with. And then, so I was libertarian, very, very angry, very critical, hypercritical on Facebook, which I got into a lot of different arguments with people on my own threads about police abuse. I had a pastor once from a church I used to be at, like, get really weird with me on a thread, and I'm like, dude, I'm not even part of your church anymore. Like, what are you doing? Like, this is weird, because I posted something from Lou Rockwell, who is himself an anarchist, right?
Yeah, he
And
was good. He
this
had
pastor, yeah.
LouRockwell.com. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so the guy, basically the pastor was like, this guy's an anarchist. Like, you can't, as a Christian, like Romans 13, yada yada yada. And I'm like, yeah, all right, like, okay, you're gonna throw that at me, like, I can already tell how simplistic that is, so I'm not gonna listen to you. But so then throughout this time of sort of struggling with kind of that's like getting into these sort of squabbles, I was like, I'm not really into that. Like, I don't really like that as a Christian to be getting into squabbles about this stuff, because I don't know if it's the thing I want people to be known for. I don't want to be known for that most. Um, so it's a long story short. Just to kind of get to where I'm at today, I sort of had a couple theological movements that pushed me in very different directions, and James K. Smith, who I've brought up before, was sort of a catalyst in this way of helping me think liturgically. And then even with his definition of the state, which I meant to get, I have desire in the kingdom behind me, which I will get because I think the quote is really essential. It's very like
Yeah, get it while I'm talking
this.
because I'm interested.
Yeah, the state has its own liturgies. You know, we're all liturgical animals.
Yes.
The state seeks to supersede what the church is. You know, it seeks to be God ultimately, which really lines up well with my sort of libertarian anarchist framework, but it pushes me in a different direction of like, my commitment is not to neoliberal philosophy about humanity and about rights. That is not my first commitment in anything. And I found myself completely at odds with what I believed as a Christian. It's theologically, I'm like, it's untenable for me to be an anarcho-capitalist or really a libertarian any longer. I still hold some of those deep moral impulses about peace at every level of society. You know, the way the market forces often will work I think are true, and I think Austrians are right about boom bust cycles, and which we're not going to get into today, but just I think those things are correct, and I do hold to that. But I also am a lot more ambiguous about what I think. Basically, the church itself is a political sphere, and I hold to that. The church's worship is the primary thing any Christian should be attending to ultimately. Weekly, faithful attending worship where we practice the Eucharist. These are itself political acts. They're not primarily political acts, but they are in themselves the truest form of the political. And this comes through thinkers like
That's fascinating.
John Milbank.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so thinkers like John Milbank, William Kavanaugh, which I want to say that I'm very Kavanaugh pilled in terms of like, there's this, he's got a book called Migrations of the Holy, God, State, and the Political Meaning of the Church. I highly recommend anybody who's interested in that. You need to read William Kavanaugh. He's absolutely a beast. He wrote a book on the myth of religious violence, which to me like just completely dismantles any new atheist argument about how you should handle religion and violence and how those two like he just completely dismantled. It's just incredible.
Does he deal like with like the history of like the Crusades and things like that? That's what I hear. Or is he dealing with contemporary issues?
So he does a couple things. He wants to level the playing field in terms of how people want to conceive of, you know, they want to overly emphasize that religion causes violence when, you know, when he did a historical study of like, say anything, you know, like Supreme Court cases in the United States. One of the first ones was about Jehovah's Witnesses refusing to pledge allegiance to the flag. I forget what year this is, but basically Jehovah's Witnesses were being beaten. They were having violence pressed against them. They were being beaten and oppressed, but it was the state and the secular that was doing the violence. It wasn't the Jehovah's Witnesses. So he's like, often what happens and what you see, and especially a lot of the new atheist authors, is like they will just completely denigrate religion, especially like the Muslim faith in the early 2000s. This is when like after 9/11, so it's really easy for people to say, look, religion causes violence, look what happens here. But then what you often find in those is like, he brings up Sam Harris as a good example, who like has a book about how he starts a book saying, you know, he completely lambasts the early Christians for burning witches and persecuting witches, but then he he makes an argument for like nuclear holocaust against the Middle East because you can't deal with these people. I'm like, so it's like so funny. He's like, yeah. Funny. So at one point he's being critical of the Christians, but then he himself makes an argument for nuclear holocaust against religious people in the Middle East because there's no rational justification, so they're not rational. So you should kill them because that's the only way you can deal with them. It's
Right.
like,
Yes.
oh, so he basically his whole argument is like, let's just talk about violence. Stop trying to like center on whether it's religious violence or secular violence. He's like, let's figure out what actually causes people to be violent. And so he does a really, to me, is like absolutely just devastating against all those the narrative of the religious violence and how we need to be more secular. But it's like it's often you find secular, states being just brutal and but it's not about body counting. It's more he just wants to like you can't just be prejudiced against one form of violence and then try to justify the other, because both are violent and both cause death and decay. So but yeah, so William Kavanaugh, really great. These guys, Milbank, James K. Smith, William Kavanaugh, really changed my mind about a
They're
lot of things. I
steering
think
you in a
Stanley
certain
Hauerwas is
direction.
sort of involved with that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, he has
Yeah.
a conversation yeah, in that world, and that is a higher, I feel like that once you get to that level for a Christian, for us it's like the higher level of political discussion, because you begin to and we could talk about that eventually, what the whole ultimate goal for Christians, because there's a debate in Christianity, between different traditions, Thomas, Lutherans, different groups of how we
like two kingdoms and yada yada yada.
yeah, all that kind of stuff. But it becomes, for Christians, not just about like, hey, here's the political mechanisms going on, so for Christians, like, that's interesting that you discovered like libertarianism, and you kind of discovered, kind of certain kind of functional parts and pieces of the market. But then as you began to dig into the theology, that brings in a richer perspective that's not just a tunnel vision of, sort of contemporary political ideologies at war. There's more that you're kind of digging into. So
yeah, there's to me, I recognize there's more fundamental things that are more important than me getting the correct way of, excuse me, burping here. The perfect way of how the state should be, or how like public society should be according to me.
Oh yeah.
I don't think that's really my job. I think no man is good for that. Like, I would say also, like, so on top of like that, like, I also really subscribe to sort of a J.R.R. Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings author. He had a remark in one of his letters. This is the one real specific time he got just talked about politics. It was like, he's like, yeah, I'm kind of like an anarchist. He's like, not a bomb throwing guy, but like more like anybody who capitalizes the S in state should be imprisoned or something like that, because it's like the serious deadly danger of centralization. He's basically a decentralizer, which I think runs really well with like a libertarian framework, but like so I'm sort of like in that camp. Like I could still see myself as an anarchist, like in that, at least in that regard. Like much more, I want to get things more local and much more decentralized, and get people more, not. I want to like. I think the federal government is. Oh my gosh, we're gonna get. The federal government is a dangerous entity that I think should be obvious by anybody by now watching the political, like, it is a disaster on every front, and the more centralized you make things, the more dangerous things become, and the less ability you have to go back. Like, you can't, once stuff gets started in place, like laws and like executive orders and like that, so whenever it gets like that, it's really hard to untie those, because when the state gets more power, the more power it craves. So I guess that's where I'm at these days. I'm still kind of an anarchist, but I'm more concerned with the Christian being framed in their political identities in the church. Ecclesially, I'm more concerned about that. That's more important to me than, I don't know, policy or whatever.
So
So that's my
Kavanaugh,
journey. That's where I'm at.
yeah. So Milbank, Kavanaugh, these guys are pushing in a direction. Um,
Hmm.
what else?
Yeah. Oh, I still hold the like Austrian economics in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. I think that interpretively is correct. Um, so anything like by Ludwig von Mises or Eugene von Baumark. I was reading some. I have a book of his. He kind of deconstructs Marx's idea of value, which I like. I'm not like a I'm not a capitalist. I don't like that term. I don't like capitalism itself. I think that's so this is funny. Like I like Austrian economics, but I don't like capitalism.
Yeah.
Like, does that make sense in
Yeah.
any way to you? Maybe it does, but maybe for some people who have listened to that are into that world, it might make zero sense.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't like capitalism at all or
Yeah.
consumerism. I think those are deadly
Hmm.
diseases.
Yeah. So
But I'm not a
everyone's,
Marxist.
yeah. So like, if anybody's familiar with it, like, if you kind of start digging into the tradition of just Austrian economics, there's kind of three major traditions: Marxism, Keynesianism, and
Hmm.
neoclassicalism. But what
Yep.
Austrian economics is, um, so I should say four main traditions. Uh, Austrian economics is a much takes the approach of economics. It doesn't try to model itself off of old positivism or scientism and
Hmm.
try to make itself look like physics, which a lot of modern
Hmm.
economics tries to
Oh
do.
yeah,
They try to make everything
big
about
time.
statistics and game theory and all sorts of charts and
Well, and
but
central banking is like rules the day for modern economics, right?
yeah,
So,
so we've all been influenced by Keynes now, but it's a kind of a fading away. All that stuff is fading away. Economics is a young discipline, but a lot of that stuff is just
mhm,
kind of creating a lot of constant failure and lack of being able to
big
predict
time.
certain things. But what's funny is Austrian economics has kind of been this staying tradition that's even informed mainline economics. And
Hmm.
so when you kind of first start digging into, you'll kind of notice like there can be different kinds of people on different sides of the aisle with economics, but you'll hear a lot of people defending like the word capitalism. In fact, Mises himself did, as
Hmm.
trying to position himself as against socialists and so forth. So someone might hear that like, oh yeah, like how can you not be for those things if you believe Austrian economics is the economics? um,
Yeah, that it's a broader conversation that you need to involve sort of a holistic framework about. You need anthropology,
mhm.
especially you need a Christian anthropology, right? This
Mm.
will help shore up some of the pitfalls of people who will want to defend capitalism. Um,
So what do
this
you
is
mean
so
by
funny because
that?
like I'm not like a well, right. So how do we think about desire? How do you reckon with we are I mean if we want to me human beings are desiring beings, like we desire to love things and to care for things and to worship, right? Because that's how we're built through a trinitarian image. So capitalism, in terms of like, whether it's like collusion with the state, like you see nowadays with big companies, pharmaceutical companies more particular these days, sort of leveraging states and governments to promote things to make money. What they do is they play and advertise on either your base desires about security and health, uh, and comfort, or they use fear to psychologically manipulate you into purchasing products when really like there's a real moral failure. You can see it everywhere in our culture about what it means, what the good is. This is another point where guys like Kavanaugh or Milbank or Smith or even the ancient tradition, it's like, what is the good? And the good in America is like full free expression for who you are. Like
with
your
no
identity needs to be able to
consequences.
be unhindered. No consequences for your expression of yourself. But often what that's tied into is an anthropology around the human being is a blank slate, and somehow the state is a neutral entity that we have to put, our own stuff on. Like there's somehow like the public sphere is somehow neutral in any way. This is very, very
We replaced the
um
Messiah
Smith.
with the state. With the
Right.
state, yeah.
Right. So like we assume in America that like first of all, oh my gosh, I want you to tell your story because I think there's interesting conversations to be had with
Okay,
both of ours.
so
But I'll just make this quick point
yeah,
here. I just want to make one quick point. I think some people think that America was founded as a Christian nation. It is an absolute lie. That never happened.
Mhm.
Most of the founding fathers are the sort of Masonic deist guys who functionally worship Satan, I would say, in the ways of like you need to somehow separate the church and the state, and somehow that's going to be a good idea because somehow the public sphere being a neutral space will create a better, more flourishing society than because of the religious violence, which ties into the Kavanaugh stuff, right? Um, so I'm not trying to be the next founding father. I'm not trying to dig into the American dream as it's been sold to people, and they've been sold a lie that the good of the American dream is you can do whatever and be whatever you want, which is itself an oppressive thing to put on yourself and to put on your kids' shoulders. Hey, you can be whatever you want.
yeah. You do you.
No, no, you can't.
Right.
I've had a very fortunate life. But even that, it's like I'm aware of my own limitations and finiteness because I am a human. I am broken. I'm deeply flawed. I'm a sinner in need of grace and mercy. And uh, so what I want to say is that once you start to recognize and interpret the sort of deeply problematic threads in American civic religion, which is mostly Masonic satanic crap that you need to get away from because it's feeding you a lie, and then capitalism feeds more into the lie. No, the way that markets will always exist because people always need to do buying and trading because that's just how we exist. And I think
Yeah.
Austrian economics has the best framework for interpreting those things. That's something different than a capitalist scheme or anyways, that's the short.
Yeah, I think
Just get
that
rid of the
makes a lot of sense.
anthropology. Yeah. Mhm.
And so um where are you at? I mean, I know our last podcast we talked about having an apocalyptic perspective. How does
Mhm.
that, and we kind of mentioned that's going to be our catalyst or launching episode to talk about politics. How
Yeah.
would you apply aesthetics to that? I know you brought up liturgy, I guess, but
Mhm. Yeah,
yeah,
liturgy is
what
a
do you think?
a
Yeah.
good way of bringing because aesthetics is intricately woven with liturgy, I think. Like those things are not it's hard to separate. It's impossible to separate those things, right? We all have some sort of aesthetic that drives us, and aesthetics is just about the embodiment of being a human and the way that things are we encounter the world. And so for me, I think it is about knowing how my heart functions and what drives what doing having a liturgical framework and an apocalyptic framework sort of puts things in the right order, let's say. So like for John in Revelation, the throne room scene in chapter 4, I was doing some I was doing a paper on this, so I was doing some research, and one of the guys talked one of the somebody I stumbled across talked about sort of imperial cults and the way that they had a whole like cosmic geography. These imperial cults had this like literal cosmology that they would center on certain things. And for John, the center of all cosmic geography was worshiping God, right? So aesthetics and like liturgy and the apocalyptic sort of view is about what is our center. right? Like, what are we centering our life on and our hearts on? And how does that how does that help us interpret the world more properly? Because the world, and whether it's like capitalism, consumerism, um, even communism, the sort of socialist utopian sort of frame, those are things that are centered in a certain way, where I think we should be centered in the worship of the triune God through his son, whose body and blood was shed for us, and week by week we eat his body and drink his blood, and that shapes us into a kind of people who give their lives for others, who loves their neighbor, who does not support violence. Do you kind of see like how I like what I mean?
Oh yeah,
Like, it
absolutely.
sounds really stupid and simple. Like, it might sound really stupid to somebody for me to say, "Yeah, just go to church every week." But if your
But
church
they
is
go,
actively thinking about,
yeah,
right? Yeah,
yeah. We go
this
all
stuff.
sorts of places every week, and we're being shaped by
Right.
them. Even our calendars, so to speak. If if you just sort of
Mhm.
over time, they've become our main public calendars are just Hallmark calendars, and they become more like state holidays, so like Thanksgiving and President's Day, and and people put
How awful.
Halloween
How
now. Yeah.
awful.
So like
Yeah.
not Halloween is a Christian holiday, but I just mean like the way
Amen.
we
It
do
is a
it
Christian
it is a
holiday.
Christian holiday, a fun one.
It is.
But
Yeah.
uh but that the Christian ones are okay to be on there as long as we have all of the state ones too. But there's a sense in where we're just being shaped by all sorts of liturgies. I mean, what in the world are we doing
Mhm.
on the 4th of July?
Right.
What is that? Bombs bursting in air and
Yeah. Mhm.
parades, into
There's a hymn.
town,
Yeah, there's a
kind
hymn.
of
Mhm.
takeover of your city. There's a conquest metaphor and a liberation metaphor, all those kinds of things that mark the American culture. And so the
Mhm.
thing is, you're shaped all the time. Bringing liturgy into your life, um, following, going to church, attending church, honoring, prayer times, feast days, those kinds of things. They
Mhm.
shape us into a different kind of person. Like all of a sudden, um,
Yeah.
like for me, once I started doing that, I developed a love for, and my saint is Saint Catherine, and
Hmm.
but things you wouldn't ever care or know about, but that person shapes you in a particular. I want to be like Saint Catherine,
Mhm.
So
Right, right.
that becomes part of your imagination, the world that you see as your reality. And
Mhm.
so if someone can get in there and change your cosmos, change your
Mhm.
icons, change
Yep.
your weekly rhythmic patterns, and if somebody could do that
Yeah, whether
strategically
it's
too,
like
they can control you.
yeah. Well, think about like you all the things you just said, like the icons of like George Washington, the Lincoln Memorial, right?
Yeah.
These are deeply religious, and I think people I've often get really annoyed when I hear very smart Christians quote Lincoln about his sort of some of his addresses that he had about God. I'm like, he's not talking about the
Don't do
Trinitarian
that.
God there. Like, I'm sorry. Like, yeah, it's not that. Like, this is different. This is a different God that he's serving here in a way. Um, and that could be controversial, but there's a way in which, like you said, like when you shift when you shift the cosmic framework, which an apocalyptic framework will do, because it necessarily disrupts your where you're at and the sort of because just like Rome had sort of a civic religion, which was much more deeply embedded in the culture, where America is sort of this crazy melting pot of like so much different diversity about things, and it doesn't quite have it like but now I sort of see it like creeping up again. One side is using they're anti-American, and they use that as like a slur or something. It's like they are worse. They have less virtue than I do because they're less pro-American because of whatever the current crisis is. They always try to split you into sides. uh, and so if you're caught up in this, what you see, the icons that are sold to you, whether it's like the images, the hymns, or like the history of the saints of America, you're gonna get swept up into this, and you're gonna be bamboozled and deceived into thinking like this is the good we should be seeking, when the good already came and fleshed and then died and rose again and ascended. So
Absolutely.
um
Amen.
yes, so it's important to work out some of that stuff in your own heart and mind, because it's honestly crazy how deceptive it can all be
Yeah, this
if
is
you're
the
not,
and if there's anyone
actively
listening,
thinking about it.
yeah, and this is the benefit of having this Christian perspective is it takes you, it decenters you from the world, I guess, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you feel more like an alien, and it's like part of,
Yeah.
two different, a world that is to come and a world that we're just waiting for. And there's a sense in which um the value of it, I think, is it takes you higher. It takes you off of those idols, and all of a sudden
Yeah.
other things become much more meaningful. You can see the suffering of the victim easier. I
Mm-hmm.
think. Who are the real victims?
Yeah, you're
Who
not.
are
Yeah, you're not like clouded by. Yeah, exactly. You're not as clouded by like ideological purity about.
yeah.
Oh, they're the right kind of victim. They're the right kind of sinner that I should
Oh
be,
yeah, absolutely.
compassionate towards. I see this it's on both sides of it too, where as long as if somebody's speaking the wrong kind of language, people are going to be less compassionate, because they're like, oh, I'm detecting some ideological thread in their words, and now I have to like cancel them, and I have to push them away because they're a bad influence, and they're going to make things worse. And it's like, do we believe that God is like providential here? Do we believe
Yeah.
like do we believe Jesus is king? I question it a lot, even for myself sometimes,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, and I should admit,
broader large. But
yeah, and and that's the thing. I think, and I should say, it should be on your journey you discover this. I don't think every Christian, like most people are like, what? White evangelicals? They think this?
yeah,
No,
right,
no. I think that
right.
it takes you have to worship it. I'm sorry, but some kind of churches are not promoting the right kind of liturgies either. They're influenced a lot
I
more by the
agree.
world. Yeah,
I'm as bold as you are on that assertion.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
Bad liturgy creates bad Christians.
yeah. And you've seen that over 4th of July. Um, so many people have seen this, the little meme or something being
They're in the
passed.
kingdom. Sorry.
Yeah, being passed by where, or there's a giant American flag behind or at the staging of a certain kind of sermon at a certain church. Well, I know how this works as a
Oh
pastor.
yeah.
This kind of culture, they try to find things that are relevant, and then they use those things as a launching point to connect their text. And many of these churches, there's no liturgy or systematic reading of, or any kind of walkthrough or literary reading of scripture. There's just a kind of a way to connect it to certain principles. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a problem in itself. But the liturgies are there.
Mm-hmm.
People will see that more than they will hear your sermon, because these are very important icons in our culture. And so when you worship with those icons behind you, you're saying something. And even if people don't pick up on it, consciously, they're being shaped by it in their subconscious.
Yeah. Deeply, in a way that they can't pick up on,
Yeah.
because they're taught to think about that ideas are the most important thing about
Mhm.
you. Ideas matter more than anything else. But we often mistaken in how we think ideas are actually communicated to us. We think it's through argumentation and rational logic, but no, it's like myth,
Mhm.
images, right? Like
Yep.
symbols. These are how
Mm-hmm.
it gets embedded in us. And
Yeah.
aesthetics and apocalyptic framework help cut through that
Mm-hmm.
pretty well. In my own life, I would think, and maybe in yours as well, because I'm also interested to hear where you are and where you came from, because I think we
Mm-hmm.
share some similar threads.
Oh yeah, we took a
And
certain.
it's
We're part of a certain
yeah,
generation that's been influenced by Ron Paul. That's what I noticed.
Ron
Uh,
Paul, man, God
yeah,
bless that man.
I'm so interested. Sociological. They don't talk about it much, but someday somebody's going to do a sociological research on all of the things Ron Paul did. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So, and I've talked about this before in our podcast earlier, but my parents were apolitical. They're pastors, and they was kind of their stance. They were pretty apolitical. Um, I grew up mostly in rural towns. My parents moved a lot when I was younger. So I got a lot of both sides of things, and my mom's side of the family was very Republican, always voted Republican, never even considered the other side. And my dad's side of the family was very Democratic, and same difference. Never considered the other side, never always thought demonized the other party, the other people. And just kind of growing up under that, I was always kind of my parents were apolitical, and then I have all these conversations going on, and so I feel like I had a lot of freedom to just think for myself, and a lot of that was by accident. But yeah, my family, yeah, so I think they would be, mainly conservative, as we're evangelical Christians. I grew up in church and so forth, and I listened to Carmen. I did. I have a Carmen record.
I've never listened to a single track of Carmen.
Yeah,
So
you weren't a Christian, right, until later. Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
I wasn't raised Christian, so it
Yeah,
wasn't
that's
part of
right.
my
Yeah.
childhood.
No, it's Christian conservatism. Then you listen to Carmen. So no, but
Right.
no, that was my background. And as I was kind of emerging into adulthood and thinking about how I was going to vote, because I had a similar situation. It was the Bush-Kerry years, and it was my first time voting, and I felt a lot of pressure from both sides of the family, and I just kind of made my own decision, but I didn't know enough about it, and so I thought, this is dumb. If I'm going to vote, I better get serious about it. And so I started delving into politics, but all sorts of things were happening, and that's what happens to most young people. At least at some point you start questioning things, and that's normal, because you can't be your parents. You can't have everybody, unless you're just going to have everyone else make decisions for you. If you want to make your own, you start thinking through them.
Yeah.
And
I think people do like other people to make their decisions for them.
So.
I do know some people. I think it's safer.
Yeah.
It's safer to do that. Just one quick aside. I remember having I remember having a conversation with my wife's one of her family members was turning 18, and I think it was it 2012, or I forget which election it was, but either way, they were turning 18, and I was having a conversation, and that person's mom and another mom was sitting there, and I was just referencing Ron Paul, and that was not smart of me to like talk about that kind of thing. They did not like that.
I think that's why we're similar. I liked being a little bit contrarian too, and I think that you're just a certain kind of person. I don't know if it, like I said, I just grew up hearing all sorts of conversations and felt like I could think for myself a little bit. I don't think everyone gets that privilege. I think there are certain kinds of things that awaken in you at certain ages, and I don't know. I don't notice it as universal. I mean, I feel like a lot of people, just kind of follow.
True. Yeah.
Follow, and I'm not saying I'm unique or anything, but I think there's a there's something that awakened in me at a certain point that led me to questioning. And different people go through this through different stages of their lives. But, and maybe a psychologist or somebody could tell me, my counselor or something. But no, I think that whatever it was, I mean, I just knew everything was messed up. And, just researching different things. My orientation then was kind of from the left. I mean, it was a dumb lefty. Just I was excited
dumb,
about
normie lefty.
Yeah, I was a normie. I was excited about Obama, at first, and then I'm like, oh, this guy's
bummer,
a Christian, dude. And but I discovered Austrian economics, and then that was like almost just a few months or whatever before Ron Paul announced his run for the presidency, and man, the rest is history. I got so super into libertarianism for a while, and it was just for all of Ron Paul's talking points, and eventually eventually became
so good.
Oh yeah. And eventually became an anarcho-capitalist like you. Although that was kind of short-lived, because though I sided with all the arguments, I was also getting into a lot of I was getting into a lot of continental philosophy at the time, and for whatever reason, like the hermeneutics and that whole world was pulling me into. There's a certain group of Austrians influenced by an economist who's still really amazing, Don Lavoie. And Don Lavoie and Ludwig Lockman, or no, maybe I'm saying his name wrong or mixing it with something else. But anyway, there's a tradition in the Austrians that got really into hermeneutical philosophy, like Gadamer, and then neo-pragmatism after Rorty and stuff, and so a lot of the George Mason University economists kind of went that direction, and so I got really into that.
Sure.
I glad I did, because I encountered Deirdre McCloskey, who got me into virtue ethics and thinking of economics as just a branch of prudence. And it does the same thing that for you kind of decentered you from saying markets are like the end all. Like, we could just have markets, and markets can be our God.
Exactly.
This takes it into a new thing. But I should say, there's another stream of influence that I have to mention, because it did influence me a lot. At least I wrestled with it. I never fully agreed with it, but I did wrestle with it, was the Reconstructionists. So Reconstructionist Christians like R.J. Rushdoony. So I kind of came from that left perspective. I was almost, getting kind of Christian woke and all that kind of stuff, which I am embarrassed of now. But because of how crazy it's gotten, but like I remember
it's gone too far. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I have so much compassion and empathy for the LGBT community, and I've dealt with it a lot with different students and people I've had to work with, and so I have a lot of compassion for the LGBT community, and so I really struggled with, especially as a conservative or historic Christian who believes in the historic sexual ethics
tradition
and tradition and anthropology. I still have a lot of compassion for the LGBT community, and but so I really struggled with that. And when gay marriage was a big hot political topic, boy, there were times in my own personal life and in prayer with the Lord, I was really wavering and struggling. But I don't know what where that came from, but so as a Christian, I was kind of back and forth with some of those things, kind of moving a little more towards, getting into liberation theology a little bit too at a certain point, and reading a lot of Moltmann, and I still love his creation book. I forget what it is.
Moltmann is pretty good on some things.
Yeah,
He's pretty good.
In Trinitarianism, this kind of very eminent Trinitarianism that you see in Moltmann and sort of post Moltmannian scholars, but there's so much there, but I don't want to delve into. But anyways, so I had that, but
but it influenced you though.
Yeah,
a lot
influenced
of stuff
me.
Is part of your influence.
Part of the journey, and so this is where I struggled with the theonomist, because I was post-millennial. I believed in post-millennial eschatology. It has to do with a weird interpretation of Revelation 19 through 21. But, so I was getting into a lot of that literature. So the people who were commenting, who were contemporary post-millennials, were also into this R.J. Rushdoony and those kinds of people.
Yeah, the Reconstructionists.
Yeah. And so they're really bizarre branches of Reconstructionism, but the kind that really pulled me in and attracted me were those who were getting more and more into liturgy. Scott Hahn, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a Catholic theologian.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
He came from that movement and eventually became Roman Catholic. James Jordan and Peter Lightheart, Ray Sutton. Ray Sutton eventually became Anglican, and he's an Anglican bishop now. And so more and more of them were getting into liturgy, because what they were discovering was liturgy, like the politics that, well, especially I like James Jordan's journey because he wanted to become the biblical theologian for the Reconstructionists. So if anybody doesn't know, the Reconstructionists believe in to really sketch
a reconstruction, if you will.
Yeah, no, I want to be a little bit. This isn't derogatory, but it's like an Americanized,
No, you're on the right path. That's what I was
constitutionalist
gonna say.
kind of theocratic view. Okay, so it's not like all the way theocratic, like The Crown theocratic, European theocratic, or
The Crown is dope. I don't know what the problem is, but that's just my own perspective.
Yeah. But what they would do is say God's law matters, and so they believe that the Old Testament continues into it's the same God who relates to us as the same God in the Old Testament. And to avoid a certain kind of Marcion heresy, they believed you also have to take on certain political principles from the Old Testament law and bring them into and apply them to contemporary society. And what James Jordan found as he started digging into that deeper was these laws are strange. They don't cover everything, like pollution laws, which would have been relevant to ancient Israel. They would have been, where do we put our poop? So these
right.
Yeah, these laws don't cover everything. And then when they do cover things, they're really strange, clean and unclean laws, eat this, don't eat that. And so what he did is he kind of rejected that theonomic Reconstructionist view, but he always still believed that God has to be our ultimate sovereign. Okay, I think that's just pretty Christian. That's pretty normal.
That's just
Jesus
correct.
is Lord. That was our very early confession. Got us in trouble politically because we wouldn't burn incense to Caesar. Okay, so they thought the church shapes culture and every area of culture. And so this goes back into a lot of the Dutch Reformed theology too. Abraham Kuyper, these people were influenced by Kuyper like I said, it's a kind of the Reconstructionists are like an American mock-up of it, but you go back and trace this back.
Yeah.
It's actually Abraham Kuyper who believes that every area of life needs to come under Christ's lordship. So we need to have therefore, he reasoned, in our worldview, we need to have a particularly Christian view, worked out view of every field of inquiry. So like science, we have to have a Christian view of science. We have to have a Christian view or perspective of philosophy. We have to have a Christian view of politics. Abraham Kuyper himself became the prime minister, is that right, of the Netherlands.
He did, yeah.
And
he was a socialist, wasn't he? Or like some form of.
He actually didn't believe
he was more of a left guy, right?
No, I'm not sure. I guess from what I remember or I understand, I guess it depends who spins him. But
yeah, that's true.
That's true. He had several principles that I think are really interesting and that I've always carried with me. He thought it was very important that we have decentralism. So he, for instance, how he addressed for them growing demand for public schooling and then all of the problems that come with centralizing the school system, problems with what do we teach the kids. They're atheists. They're growing people. He's actually anti-French Revolution. They're part of an anti-French Revolution or anti-revolution party.
Yeah. I'm into that. Yeah, I'm into that for sure.
So, but here's how he dealt with. There are atheists in our country. There are Christians. There are all sorts of different Christian denominations. There's Catholics. There's Reformed Christians, and so. We think parents should have the right to, they are the ones who are responsible for educating their children. And institutions, certain schools, should have a right to teach those kids what the parents are asking them to teach the school, or asking the school to teach the kids. So simply put, this means atheists can have their own school, Christians can have their own, and so forth, just so long as we all have the right. And so where he's getting this, he had a theory that he had developed as a kind of political theory where he believed when he looked at government and how various institutions are governed, institutions like the family, the state, business, maybe there's another institution you can think of, that they have the responsibility to govern in a way that particularly fits them, and they can't totalize their governance. They can't say, hey, we're the CDC, we're a health organization, we're going to totalize and govern every area of your life. Or we're the state, and so we're going to totalize and we're going to tell the kids how they should be educated. We should tell people what they can buy and sell. We should tell, they'd say that's overstepping their realm of authority. And so he really applied his theory in his own governing, and he sought to see things that way. So he would always kind of say the responsibility for schooling is the parents. So, I mean, I don't have, as a leader, I can't tell you what you should be doing to educate your kids. Now, again, for the government, if there's abuse involved or something like that, he would say, hey, now this has become a, not just a family issue, but now this is a broader community issue. There's something that the state has to do is protect you from this violence or something. So, he had this view where he broke things down. It was a way of decentralizing authority and placing it in the hands of those who were most responsible and most directly involved with dealing out that authority. And later, there's a philosopher named Herman Dooyeweerd who took on Kuyper's idea of trying to come up with a Christian philosophy, and he took that sphere sovereignty and he actually used that for his own thought, where he emphasized non-reduction. So he'd say all the different sciences, and I'm using that in the classical sense, not physical sciences, but all the sciences, logic, math, various physical sciences. He actually came up with a whole system of categories, like Kant's categories, but they're differently structured, of modal aspects. And he would just say the problem with all Western philosophy is that it began with the pre-Socratics, is trying to reduce everything down to one theory, or one theory that can account for all other theories. And
Stephen Hawking was really into that when he was, right? The theory of everything.
Yeah, theory of everything. Yeah. And this is not like, I think, and I would argue that you could maybe have a theory of everything for the field of sciences, but it won't cover metaphysics. It won't get you into deeper metaphysical or ethics or even economics or something. So you could have
almost like you need the metaphysical to like even have a theory of everything, right? Like you sort of need that front loaded before you can even try to. So
I totally agree. And Dooyeweerd would believe these kind of stack up. He believed they're all real even before we experience them. So at the moment of creation, God creates everything. Now he was even controversial in saying God creates logic, which goes against a certain Augustinian tradition that says logic is the mind of God. So when we detect these truths, God is truth. So therefore we're participating in God intellectually in that way.
I would say that's more of where I'm like, I've claimed to be a Christian Platonist. That's more of how I see it. But so just to
so he critiques both Platonism and Thomism and says it's really neither. And I believe he gets actually closer to the Eastern view of a kind of energy. He didn't have a category for it, but the divine energies. But God's personal mystical mediation is at the core of it. God, in other words, God created all things seen and unseen. He also created logic and logical realities. And he gets this, so like Gregory of Palamas says, if there are any perfect attributes in God, he created them. Which is really, I don't know, that's mind-blowing. And it's a different kind of tradition than the Western tradition of perfect being theology. But not to veer too far off track there, but
So in terms of influence for political reasons, for your journey,
Dooyeweerd begins to play a part because as I go down, liturgy plays a part. Dooyeweerd and the Kuyperian tradition begins to play a part because I start seeing the decentralism, and I think it fits very well with kind of saying Austrian economics is a certain modal perspective, and it's right about that area that it speaks to. And it gives you categories there that work there. But and I was influenced a lot by Deirdre McCloskey, who says she brought in Christian virtue theory. She brings that into her view, her philosophy. It's a lot closer to Alistair McIntyre, and which is basically that the tradition just has it better. And the economics is basically prudence. It's how to, of course we'd love to feed the whole world, but it would be best if we can all participate in, sharing goods through exchange or mediums of exchange.
Mm-hmm.
So much we could talk about there, but um, we'd love to give people infinite access to all the great things in life, but we live in a world of scarce resources. So economics basically throws us into
Yes.
prudence. Yeah. So it basically says, okay, like I love to do everything good that there is ever to do that's good, but I got to focus on this one thing because this is a scarce resource that I value, and that so it doesn't reduce things down to economics, and that's why we just started to get an allergy against is reductionism. Like anytime we try to say it's all about biology, it's all about physics, it's all
I'm
about,
immediately like, nope,
yeah,
nope,
it's all about this. The only thing I can say it's all about is Christ, and that's one thing that I'm extremely committed to. But and I think that's what you get from a Christian perspective. This it drives you towards Christocentrism, and I think Trinitarian centrism. I mean, all of a sudden the Holy Spirit, I think, which has been an underdeveloped theology in the West, both East and the West. I think, there's all sorts of ways that once you start thinking about the Holy Spirit and His role and what the Bible says and revelation about that changes things too. So, okay, so that shaped me in a particular way, and then also 2020 shaped me in a particular way.
Yeah, sorry. 2020 really also shaped. I think that was one of our, when we reconnected, it was like, 2020 sort of shattered me in a lot of ways and radicalized me in other ways that I didn't see coming.
Yeah, see, here ago. I wasn't just Austrian economics and all that, whatever, and I was kind of just, I was almost entertaining the idea, well, if we had stayed or whatever, because I'd been anarchist before. But then it's like 2020 hits and it's like, oh man, this is real deal stuff. And so all that Ron Paul in me started coming back out. And but no, I've been getting into like left anarchism, post anarchism. So left anarchism would be like Kevin Carson, and same thing that you expressed, where they're market capitalists, or they're market anarchists, but they're against capitalism, because capitalism has always been about this kind of merging of state and corporate interests. In other words, the state has a client. And it's not you, the people. It's the corporations. It's the people that feed them.
Now, I know that it's been defined before as like, that's not capitalism, that's corporatism.
Yes.
And while I can concede that, it's like, but I think that still fits a sort of capitalist. The maximizing of profits also involves state intervention to create more maximizing of profits, right? Like, it's not you can try to like
we couldn't get the kind of projects we wanted to, kind of drugs we wanted to, with I think complete decentralism. It takes propping up big pharma and taking their responsibility away, being able to sue them and so forth. I also think that I do agree with Kropotkin that at the core of human relationships is relationship and cooperation. But I'm also, I still have some Protestant in me. I still believe that human nature is also broken and corrupted, and that we want to bypass that often. So I do have a realistic view, but because every once in a while you run into people who are like advocating something like anarchism and like, oh, well, I'm more like Hobbes, I don't have this optimistic view of human nature. Like if we just got rid of the state, we'd all cooperate. And I don't think you need that. Like, so I think,
no.
Yeah. Plus, again, it goes back to the theological perspective that I think Christ reigns, and the Spirit, the Holy Spirit is what brings us together. So at least prescriptively, I would say at the core is human relationship with God, human relationship with neighbor, human relationship with God's creation. And of course it's broken, but why not heal it? Why not bring it back, restore it, influence communities to operate this way? That kind of thing. So the markets, that's what's happened, is the idea of markets and those things are not absolutized in my view. And then I would also say this strange thing happens once you start really reflecting on Christ as Lord, Christ as King of the cosmos. And we talked about Apocalypse, reading Revelation. And all of the kings must bow. There's a prophecy in Micah 4 and Isaiah 2 where kings will lay down their swords. Some point, the kings will lay down their swords and beat them into plowshares and take their swords and turn them into pruning, or their spears and turn them into pruning hooks. So, and learn to make war no more. So I think that, yeah, for me, I've always had that hope in it that eventually just it won't work anymore to be so political, so authoritarian, and that the more the Spirit moves, the more things will break down. That's my optimism.
I think people, I think I'm an optimistic person, in the sense of, I know God like wins this. I know what the end game is, right? So I'm very optimistic and hopeful about that. But I'm also extremely aware and pretty realistic about my hopes about any of this stuff we have going on now. Even back, through all this time, when you start looking and studying history, you start seeing how sinister and suspicious and behind the scenes things, what's happening. So it only makes me think of like, well, what's going on right now behind? Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a sense in which, I don't trust anything, but I also my lack of trust in the things now make me trust God infinitely more, if that's possible.
Yeah, and
which is hard to do. I would say, I was just gonna say, I've had a couple conversations with people who, like you and I, had a really rough time in 2020. There was this disillusionment they had with the system they thought was rational and you could participate in, and it was like legitimate. Now they see things as not legitimate, and they become very bitter. And so I was having a conversation with somebody about like, they asked me like, how do you not get bitter? And it's like, well, if you think that to me, if the church is the end goal, the end game, then you focus on, you start to think about how creation is made new, not the church's goal. Part of it, so like I kind of answered in a few different ways, mostly because I've sort of been in this train of suspicion for a very long time. So now I've like woven it into sort of like a theology, if you will, of like you said, there's this Protestant part of me that's like, people are just deeply so broken, and that you get power, you're going to want to stay there, and you're going to want more of it. And there's more sinister things even there. But part of me, my answer was like, boy, we just really need to worship God. Like, that's what we need ultimately. And if it doesn't lead to that, then like, that's the wrong kind of attitude, right? Like, I can be bitter, but like, bitterness only leads to more anger and more violence, and more like it fractures more than it brings together. Bitterness is not a virtue, no matter how much people try to sell you that. Bitterness is not the way forward.
And I think that gets me to my final. What's been influencing me lately is Rene Girard. And a lot of people have been getting into this. I had read some stuff on Rene Girard years ago, and even was kind of developing some of my theory of atonement based on him and Andrew
Mm-hmm.
Robinson and some of those things. But I had not paid much like detailed attention to Rene Girard. And then one of my friends was like, man, I asked him, what have you been reading? He's like, Rene Girard. I'm like, oh, yeah, he's great. He's like, no, you don't understand. Like, he's like,
No.
he knows what's going on. He's like completely uncovered what's going on right now in everything.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what? He's like, oh man, he has a theory for everything. So you gotta check him out. So, what we've been kind of talking about here is oftentimes violence as it relates to politics, authoritarianism. How can we tame it? How can we hold it back? How can we make sure it's not so crazy? Anarchism, maybe that's a way. But, I'm skeptical that even if we got that sort of Ancapistan or whatever it would be, that we're just going to cycle in another state, because rivalry and human sin and violence is, and until that's healed, until that core thing is addressed, which is spiritual, which is religious, which is it's also an act of sanctifying yourself. It's a liturgical process, a very prayerful process. It's a lifelong process. I think that we will continue to cycle up different kinds of violences. And so, what do I mean? Well, Rene Girard, he has this idea that he calls mimetic theory. He's an anthropologist. He believes when he studies all human cultures and then also literature, he's a literary critic, that what he sees as a common thread in human beings is, and this just goes to a psychological point, we imitate. We imitate our parents. Our dad gives us a smile and we smile back the same way. Uncle Sam, makes a goofy face and we do the same thing. And we can be infants. And we do this. We imitate. How do we learn a language? We imitate the sounds and the shapes and the things that we hear. We're imitative beings. Essentially liturgical beings. But not only that, but what's behind that, we don't just mimic people like copying. What would be the point of that? It's that we desire something. We desire what they desire. And so Rene Girard systematically goes through in many of his books what that entails. So how do we explain, like, two kids, one kid reaches for a toy, he likes it, he puts it down, he goes for another toy, but he notices his brother goes and grabs that same toy he just had and realizes, oh man, I wanted that more than I thought. What happens? He puts down the other toy and fights with his brother. And it leads to slapping and poking and pushing. And It doesn't matter what your family is like. You might have the most wonderful, beautiful family ever, but if you have kids, you notice this right away. You have to deal with all that rivalry. And and so, but it's in human nature. And so we do that. We want what other people have. And we make even something that could be a mass resource, something for rival. It's not just, I want this pair of pants at the store. I want that pair of pants. And so, there's just weird things that can happen. We make everything a scarce resource. So even just Austrian economics isn't going to deal with this. I think it's related.
Nope.
But what's at core is, what ends up happening is the escalation of violence. And when that happens amongst groups and broader communities, you get scapegoating. Eventually, the two groups, in order to resolve the violence, have to resort to some person that stands for them as the thing that they're upset about or rivalrous about. Usually that person has something to do with that in some way. So let's say Rome, for instance, had a whole group of people that they'd keep. I forget what they're called, but people they would keep aside who are just horrible people. They're axe murderers or whatever, horrible people. They'd keep them in cages, not just kill them, but keep them in cages. And when things got really bad politically, they would bring these people out and crucify them or torture them or whatever, and everybody would be like, "Oh yeah, we finally got this guy." And so that scapegoating happens in states, and what Rene Girard points out in Violence in the Sacred is that it's religion that puts it at peace, but Christianity has set things off in a different direction, because we've now found out that the scapegoat can actually be and was God himself a victim. And all of a sudden God himself identifies with the scapegoat and the victim. So now what we have in societies that have been influenced by Christianity is we have a competition for victim status, or at least who controls scapegoating and victims. And
yeah, it's like, just to hear that phrase alone, it's like, yeah, he figured that out a while ago, and it's all just like really bearing out now, like more than ever before.
It's just it's so cartoonish right now that we can see it better than we could before. He talks about in Violence in the Sacred how secular governments, we kind of tend towards having law being that mediation, not necessarily religion, but law becomes that, justice, finally got justice. You see it in all our movies, the CIA agents, they're motivated by justice and we want to get revenge. And then we finally get that, and then everything's peaceful, everything's calm. But when that breaks down, like right now in our society, we're in a free-for-all. The scapegoating gets really large and really cartoonish. Before, it still was happening, but it was hidden, and you couldn't really see it because you saw justice. You're like, that person finally got it, what they deserved. But was oftentimes, especially in public figures, still scapegoating. But anyways, so that's influencing me a lot right now politically. But I would say all that kind of spins up into a certain constant thing I'm thinking about, is whatever movement I'm into, I always kind of take a step back and say, I wonder what Jesus thinks. It's kind of the goofy Sunday school question. I want to be Christocentric. What is Jesus like? What does he think? And so I do think, the politics of Jesus, and, there's a famous book by John Howard Yoder, The Politics of Jesus. It's a really good one. But I don't even go there. I think that that you have to take a step back and think about it. God is about liberating people from slavery. And Jesus confronted, you read the book, The Maker versus the Takers by Jeremy Boyer, or whatever his name is, the last name Boyer. Jesus, when he's in Galilee, he doesn't really push too hard on the rich or whatever, because they're very decentralized. It's a merchant town, trade town, working town. They basically, Jesus was a carpenter and a mason, and actually probably did really good work. And there wasn't a gap between the rich and the poor. It was a much more flourishing middle class there. This is all contemporary discovery too. We found like big houses. People used to think Galilee was poor because Jesus must have been poor. He stood up for the poor. They must have been a horrible town, but they're like a stop, like a trade stop between, as you're traveling, between north and south, north and Egypt, south.
Wait, Jesus was middle class? What?
I don't know. I try to be careful there because I don't know. I don't know. I think he, if you read Maker versus the Takers, and you can have your own opinion there, but what's more interesting to me is, because location matters, the closer that Jesus gets to the politically connected, to Jerusalem and the temple and those who are and the year of Jubilee is a huge theological theme throughout the Old Testament and in Jesus as the Lord of the Sabbath and announcing the year of Jubilee. as he gets closer to Jerusalem, his rhetoric gets really strong. In fact, he gets crucified because his rhetoric gets so crystal clear and pointed.
Mm-hmm.
And things he does in his last parable and stuff like that, things he says, the rich man and Lazarus was a very pointed, very specific political mockery of a certain high priest and his sons his son or something at the time. Anyway, yeah. So Jesus is pointing at how the temple is exploiting the poor through taxation and through this loophole that they're finding through debt and taxation. And so I do have to say this: Jesus, when you ask what are the politics of Jesus, he would be against giant corporations taking power and exploiting the people through some kind of taxation or some kinds of forms of that. And so anyways, that's kind of a way for me to kind of weed out all sorts of political philosophies and social systems. And in other words, I don't think we can just be pragmatic here, like, oh, let's just find out things that work. When you go to a lot of secular or just your normal garden variety mainstream views of politics these days. I was reading in preparation for this a very short introduction to politics. I think it's Miller, a European guy. Just super bland. Very functionalist in the view of political realities. And I think that's what we've just been reduced to. Is like, hey, what works? What kinds of stuff do
works?
Yeah,
fine. It works okay.
Yeah, or it's like, there's these problems and then there's these problems, but then there's this thing and it's a little better than this thing. And what it really just ends up is people who are powerful, who have certain ways to get what they want, will continue to exploit the system. And
and our lack of ability. This is what frustrated me, especially now, and I know you agree with me on this because we've chatted about it.
Yeah,
is the way in which both left and right exploit people deeply for their own gain and benefit. Whether it's like in particular, I'm just thinking of the leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement, not the phrase or the belief, but like the actual like movement, the BLM movement. I mean, they're buying houses in gated communities. I mean, this is. I know. There's a Twitch streamer who claims to be a socialist, but bought a $3 million house, and he like yells at his donator, or his fans, for not donating, or some. It's like, these people are grifters, man. These people aren't. They're like you said, they're very functionalist. Like, as long as this works for me, or like if I can get the message out, because what's important is I'm getting the message out, but yet I can still live like completely against what I would ultimately be preaching about. Somehow I'm not part of the exploitation.
Well, the whole George Floyd thing is an extremely good example of Girardian realities.
God, it's incredible.
Because as people who kind of, we've been into economics and politics, I mean, we see problems. I really feel for that, for the George Floyd situation, many others who have experienced police brutality, and it's horrible. But we're not getting to the root of the problem. So even the civil rights movement was about changing certain Jim Crow laws and actually like real policies. I'm sure there's scapegoating there too, but you could see when we're much more Christian, when it was much more specific, when you had a Christian movement like Martin Luther King Jr. and stuff, and Christians, black men and women and other people standing up against Jim Crow laws and against those, like it was about real policy. What we see here is, I don't know what, it's about virtue signaling or something. And what
it's,
yeah. And I see, so like, for me, I said, like, there's all these problems with the militarization of police and the centralization,
that's always
the
been a
police
problem.
unions. And so it's like, okay,
Always been a
yeah,
problem.
yeah, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, let's change, let's reform it. And what we got was a public display of a hanging, basically, of
Yep.
the police officers
Yep.
involved. And it was very religious. It was very Girardian. And people went home and they breathed the breath of justice finally was served. And it, things died down. So like as someone who's coming at this from a Christian, being, much more persuaded towards an anarcho-Christian perspective, this kind of game that we're playing needs to be uncovered and realized. But I know we're in a free-for-all right now, so it's like just the whole culture is sort of going nuts.
To even chat about that stuff as like a couple of white dudes is itself a dangerous thing, a dangerous game to play, because part of what happens is, right, like you have that movement. Right, I'm not supposed to do that because I have privilege, I guess, and to talk about any sort of, like what you just said. It's like we're playing these games, and I watch this whole thing unfold. I'm like, well, there's been much worse police killings that I've seen over the years, and none of them got any sort of traction. Why this?
Yeah.
Why is this the one?
And I'm totally okay.
Why is Floyd
And I'm totally okay if we're like, as a movement, we're going to pick this one. This is just the one we're going to go for. But man, let it be for real change. I thought it was funny because, the people were really trying to,
happened.
Like Rand Paul, who was trying to actually get police reforms.
The no knock
raids,
right? Like
exactly.
Yeah.
He was chanted
these people
from a crowd that were like say her name, and they were talking about like he just got done advocating for.
Dude, he's on your side. I know. He's on your team more than anybody else is going to be in the state legislature.
Yeah,
this dude is on your team. His dad is on your team. They may be a couple of white guys, but they're what they're trying to do is they're trying to dismantle some of these really dense sort of things that are in place that you have to strike at the root, or you're never really going to deal with.
Yeah, I would love for someone to use like intersectionality or critical race theory and kind of like do an internal push back, because I understand. I think we'd be careful not to react so much in weird directions. What I like to say with even just the intersectional thing, we don't have much clout as we're a couple white guys, so take it or leave it. But here's the thing, Rand Paul and those kinds of the idea is, okay, if you're white, use whatever privilege you have to advocate for this, advocate for the victim, whatever. That's what he was doing. And so that you have to understand, if you really want actual real world things to change, not just your imagination or the dreams you have at night to change, there real policy changes, real things going on. So I forgot, I was kind of on that tangent, but
I think the point is like that whole movement last year of Floyd and this sort of explosion, it was Girardian, happens, right?
Yeah.
It's very Girardian, and it's but what it led to was ultimately, like you said, like a public hanging, but through the same system that is apparently systemically a problem,
right?
But but how we deal with those systemic issues, if we want to focus, to me, it's like we're always focusing on sort of a almost too narrowly on like maybe racism is a really important issue, which I do think that racism certainly has a part to play in the stuff. But what you have is like a system that is centralized on violence. It's supposed to be violent. That's the nature of the state itself. Yeah.
And a non-reductive perspective would kind of force you to say, okay, this racism is a thing. Okay, yes. But what are all the other things that, because you want to know, it's not just like someone, jumping out and calling someone a name or doing so. It's like, if it's a systemic thing, because figure out what that is. If it's being driven by something, if it's if the same people are getting voted in who also helped create the systemic structural problems, so like this is why this world is a clown world to me right now. Why everything is so goofballs and we're in a free for all is because like these are so blatant and obvious. Like these are just like argument stopper kind of, or just goofy things going on that just seems like anyone would kind of stop and think. But I do think, it's scary for people, so they got to cope a lot of times by just kind of, if you can lull yourself to sleep or get yourself distracted or do something different, and what we're saying is not like, okay, let's go join the Libertarian Party. Let's like take them down. Let's do crazy things.
Don't do that. No, don't do that. That's a bad idea.
We're saying let's get liturgical, which might seem strange. Let's pray. Let's okay. Oh yeah, whatever. No, like if you want to be serious with it, we got to get to the core of it. Which if it has to do with the mimetic rivalry, that. All Rene Girard is doing is highlighting a particular sin that leads to violence and cycles in these giant circles. It takes something like you see in John's Apocalypse it takes angels and demons. It takes or warfare. It takes all sorts of things like that going on, as well as your own kind of prepping and positioning to strengthen your faith, to when it comes time for you to have the opportunity to do something, you can do it confidently or do something for the Lord. But yeah, it's not going to just be, you're not going to get there by just, living your life and never engaging with prayer, never engage, those kinds of things. And then just like all of a sudden you're going to come up with the best strategy or the best. No, you'll get caught up in the same cycles of violence because we're weakened.
Yeah. It's almost like the liturgical takes you out of wanting to be in the planning or something. Like you want to just be enveloped by the one who is in charge. You know what I mean? Like
I'm not
not that you don't it's not that you don't want to get invested or involved. Like I'm personally not a pragmatist at all. Like I'm a ruminator. I'm a guy who thinks and reads and wants to have sort of principally engaging the world in such a way where I'm not getting like swept away. Yeah. But I'm like deeply suspicious of pragmatic solutions because I see intentions are all fine and well, but when the mechanism itself just reaps destruction, exploitation, I'm like, I don't really want to. I think I just see it as like a more of a net loss than anything else. Whatever intentions were had in the beginning are just washed away by a sea of violence and exploitation.
Yeah. So if we reduce everything down to one thing, it will probably not work. It will probably be wimpy. And
no.
Yeah. So from here now is if we're involved, this gets back to just even I think the deeper thing that if Christ is Lord, he's still on his throne. All kings, all kingdoms must bow. All kings must pay allegiance to him. Everything has to come under his footstool. I think that kind of spiritual stance creates something powerful, because here's the problem, and this is kind of goes back to kind of a Nietzschean thing, is so what if we gain some kind of utopia or we get what we want? What then? Why am I still empty inside? That kind of thing.
To what end?
Yeah.
To what end are we doing it?
And what's really going to motivate me when I have to think about like, oh man, this is really going to cost me. Like I might have to go to jail for a while, or I might have to have some kind of, thing that I like taken away. If it's not motivated by something deeper and much more solid, like Christ is King of the cosmos, I think it's not. If it's not, doesn't have that revival fire behind it, it's not going to do anything politically.
Yeah. Well, I think you desire. I mean, again, maybe going back to the importance of why ritual is so vital to understanding, like even the development of the fire, because ritual is part of us encountering the the triune God in the spirit, but
Or like
that's
incense
done through,
burnt
right,
on fire
ritual,
with the incense going up to heaven in prayer.
right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
which
Like, or
itself
like
is
the prayers of the
liturgical.
saints are incense. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like the whole scene, Revelation 4 is a liturgical worship setting. It's a
Mhm.
liturgical worship
Mhm.
through with the celestial beings, right? With
Mhm.
the, I don't know if there's seraphim, cherubim. It's sort of like
Mhm.
it's murky there because he sort of uses two different. He
Mhm.
uses both Isaiah and Ezekiel in
Mhm.
his imagery, and
Yeah.
then you have the 24 elders. But like either way, they're singing hymns, they're falling on their knees, right? They're casting the elders are casting their crowns. Then you have the prayers of the saints, which are in the bowls, but with from the, I think the elders are holding the bowls, I believe, in chapter 5. But it's a liturgical thing, and the power of ritual is you're going to be you're encountering rituals everywhere you go, but which ones are the most formative and important for you?
Mhm.
Is it the political rituals of American civic religion and the political,
Mhm.
or is it the liturgy and the rituals of the church through the call to worship, right? So if you just go through a traditional liturgical ritual setting, the call to worship, God calls us, like the the demand is only just to come and see, and then he calls us into worship, then we sing the hymns, and then we hear his word read, then we confess our sins, and then we're absolved, and then we hear the word preached, and then you pray. Through all this whole time you have prayer going on, and then you partake in the supper or Eucharist. These are all like this rituals are just getting the engine and the fire just burning even deeper, right? It's like a deeper burning that wells up because of your participation in it, and your participation is active and passive at the same time, because first it's active in that you're just getting there, your body's doing the movements, but then the spirit itself is working on you, every week you go, you're getting worked on and worked on,
Mhm.
and then eventually it manifests itself in your life, and that will manifest itself in your sort of political view. And
Yeah.
I do hope for it, like what I hope for in terms of people being is to we have to go against the exploitation
Mhm.
of each other, men and women, children as well, and the system itself, whether it's the players in the system or something higher and sort of behind the shadow demons that are involved, because I think they definitely are. um we need to be aware of that, and we have to learn how to we have to learn how to resist the exploitation, and that's only through the Christian liturgy can we actually accomplish that well. Not perfectly, because that's not that's not what this is about. It's about like living a deeper and having a deeper perspective, a longer gaze than just 4 years ago.
Right.
Like,
Right.
you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
we have to have a longer perspective for both our
Mhm.
politics and our view of God's work
Mhm.
in the world and salvation history.
Yeah. So the
So
decentering of politics and economics for me, it actually has made me place theology as more centric. So in that way, I have much more
it's
of a
it's the
medieval
queen again
view.
for me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the queen
It's
of
the
the
queen. It's the queen
sciences,
of the sciences.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and philosophy is a handmaiden. And I understand.
Mhm.
It's not that we want to go back to some me personally, I don't want to go back to some medieval situation per se. I want to look forward
You
to
want
the
to go to a feudal
future.
system?
No. um,
Yeah, I don't really either.
yeah, not that we can't talk about why the modern state is new and
It's
there is
basically
nothing as
feudal
exact.
anyways.
Yeah, well, and we've never had anything like the modern state in all of human history, and
It's true.
probably those situations were a lot more. There's different
Mhm.
kinds of liberties you might have, but
Yep.
the but I think what I mean is that I think in the future when we're kind of thinking about that, was we're completely healed. It will be
Mhm.
one where as St. Augustine says it's not good for us just to be good, but for us to desire the good. So we want a future where we choose and desire to choose the good, personally. And so I think that a completely healed world will look like one that is completely free of slavery and rivalry, and of course all those things that come from the destruction of
Revelation 18, I think, talks about, because one big topic for me, and this isn't going to go into any sort of tirade because we're really pushing the limit here of our podcast, but
attention spans have
human
dropped
sex
off long ago.
Yeah, which is cool. I'm just but for me, human sex trafficking is like the modern plague in the world, and it is something I feel like I want hellfire to rain down upon the earth and be judged for it. And I don't care if I if I perish in the process, so be it. But this cannot last.
This can't happen in God's world.
And so, it cannot. And so that's a big motivator for me about my political perspective and how I think the world should, what it actually is justice is when that kind of thing. And human trafficking, it spans a lot of different things. It's not just one thing or the other, right? It's not like I can't reduce it to like it's this thing. It's actually a multitude and has a lot of symptoms that come from people who are exploited primarily, right? Like, so it is fundamentally exploitation, which to me is like part of what we need to battle against as the people of God. And but that's a very big motivator for me in terms of what gets me really angry and what gets me passionate about things is that topic. More than anything else to me is like we still have slavery in the world. It's just somehow so behind the scenes that we don't even really talk about it in an everyday life, even though literally men, women, and children are being trafficked across the globe.
If it doesn't show up
every day
on the news, the corporate news, we don't see it.
Or it shows up and they dismiss things as conspiracy theories.
Right.
It shows up, but then it's like, well, unless if the person who they're investigating is the wrong letter next to their name, then it's valid. But only then is it valid. If they have the letter of the party that we like in their name, then we're not going to talk about it. But if it's the wrong party, then we'll talk about it. And therein lies like deep injustice just in that fact alone. I also wanted to say I have a quote from John Milbank that goes really well with what you were saying about theology and how where you've sort of put it and sort of he says we can kind of conclude here shortly, but he says the pathos of modern theology is its false humility. For theology, this must be a fatal disease because once it surrendered its claim to meta discourse, meta being, it cannot any longer articulate the word of the Creator God, but is bound to turn into oracular voice of some finite idol, such as historical scholarship, humanist psychology, or transcendental philosophy. If theology no longer seeks to position, qualify, or criticize other discourses, then it is inevitable that these discourses will position theology. And I think he's just dead on.
Oh, absolutely
correct.
And
about
don't,
that.
don't we see that nowadays? And what's sad is even in our seminaries, I mean, that's what we've seen is we've seen all these other things done, and it's because we're too afraid to make theology all it just means is Christ is king. And so as we're thinking about it, as we're trying to be humble about theology and thinking about it, I think we have to be careful. You don't just run on a tangent, but as we carefully think through these, I mean, we just realize that they just affect everything, and it affects your politics, affects your view of humanity and what what we're like, and the arts and everything else. So it's so important, in my mind, that we not allow culture to set the narrative, or to control the narrative. There, what do you use? He said,
Yep.
did you say meta narrative?
Exactly.
It is a
The
meta
meta
narrative.
discourse.
Meta discourse.
Yeah.
This is meta discourse, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So
It's I mean, I think to sum it up is like, we're doing this theologically, right? Like, it's not first and foremost like philosophy or like historical, study or psychology, right? Like you said, non-reduction is the way forward, and this theology as being the center makes it non-reductive, because everything sort of can come in and out of it, and when theology can sort of be the anchor with
it
which
holds it
all these
together.
other things work from. Yeah, it holds it together really well, as Jesus is king.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's good. A good way to conclude. So, yeah, thank you for listening. For those of you who've stuck with us
If
this
you've made it
far,
this far.
I'm so proud of you. If you like this podcast, hit like, follow us, give us some crypto, and we're on most platforms. So stay tuned for our next episode. Are we going to weave in and out of politics, or are we just going to take it from here?
I don't know.
Surprise.
I think we could probably do another episode. I think it would be more to the ground, and maybe even offering critique of things.
Theory.
But it's probably going to be weaving in and out. It's going to be weaving in and out, probably more than likely.
Because I want folks to know, like we're not, like, even in preparation for that, I'm like kind of digging back into like Plato and Aristotle. Like, we're going through, kind of like walking through. We could talk about like what has been the story of political philosophy, and why should it come under
the narrative?
Why should it come at the footstool of Christ? I mean, if 2020 hasn't convinced you enough, but maybe you're
I don't know how
like,
it hasn't.
But people are different places here and seeing different things, so it's good for us to be like, we're not just, I guess for me, I do think there's a way that we can aiming at getting close to something like a politics of Jesus without being goofy about it, and it's like, oh, it's my Democrat or Republican brand,
it's
or
like,
my libertarian brand.
It's like even like a like a pet
like
theology
a cartoon,
of Jesus' politics or something.
I just take
I'm not into that.
Yeah. That's not what we want. We want we want to admit our baggage. That's why we told our stories, and take the conversation from there.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
Yes.